and I'm going to do better in the future and get myself plugged in and engaged. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on 3 primary things, and then we will get to have some Q&A and some time to chat and discuss afterward. So I want to spend some time digging into what the current research tells us about environmental education effectiveness. And I also want to look at some different metrics, some different indicators of effective environmental education. So how do we know that our efforts are working, and how can we document those efforts? And to really kind of critically think about some of the gaps in practice when it comes to environmental education evaluation. And then I want to cap us off and lead us into discussion by offering some food for thought about how we can ensure that environmental education remains both effective and relevant in light of some of the current social and environmental challenges we are facing, particularly related to COVID-19. So to give you some context for these pictures that you're seeing on the screen before we jump in, I led a student trip to Belize a couple of years ago over the winter break, and I had 11 students on that trip with me, all women. Some of them had never traveled outside of the US before, and the focus of the trip was One Health. So we were really trying to understand some of the different ways that human health is connected to environmental health. And one of the people we met on the trip was Geraldine, so you can see her pictured at the top. She worked for a community organization called the Community Baboon Sanctuary, which is located in a town called Bermudian Landing. And it's a conservation initiative that really focuses on connecting with private landowners, collaborating with private landowners to conserve native species. So they do a lot of work with black howler monkey conservation, jaguar, tapir, and many migratory bird species that spend their summer months here with us in Western Pennsylvania. So that's kind of a cool connection. We got to see some of them on the trip. And so this picture is here to give you some context about the power of environmental education to guide experiences and behaviors, which are some of the metrics that we'll be talking about a little bit later. And Geraldine was such an amazing educator that she was able to actually get my students to eat termites. So that's what you're seeing in the picture on the left. And in case you're wondering, termites taste like a combination of carrots and mint. So if you can imagine a minty carrot and what that would be like, that's what you get when you eat a termite. I did it too, so I can vouch. So environmental education at its best informs, but it also inspires. And it does this in a way that motivates individual and collective action to address the challenges that we face as a society. And that can result in making the world a better place, right? So pretty idealistic and optimistic, but that's really where we're headed with what we want to achieve with environmental education. So who am I? How did I get my start? So I grew up in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which is about an hour and 45 minutes east of Pittsburgh. So it's kind of an urban, small city type of setting. And around 4th or 5th grade, I remember going on a field trip to Stackhouse Park. So this is like a little kind of nature park in the middle of the city, very small, very close to my neighborhood. And we got to participate in some water quality sampling, play around in the stream, learn about the species that lived in the stream. And I also would go there a lot with my mom and go hiking, and my mom and I would explore our yard together in the neighborhood. So lots of early childhood experiences just out exploring with my mom and with my classmates in school. So Sarah mentioned that I majored in wildlife biology, and what's really interesting about my career trajectory is that after I graduated, I got a job as an environmental educator. But I had zero training in how to do environmental education, which is actually quite common in our field. And so I was working at a wildlife park, and I got to raise baby mountain lions and wolves, which was really pretty fun. So that's what you're seeing here in the pictures. But I also got to oversee our public programming. And I started to wonder, after being in that role for several years, is any of this making any kind of a difference? Like, I'm spending all of this work working with public audiences. How do I know that it is effective? So that was what eventually led me to go on to graduate school, and had the opportunity to work on program evaluation as a research emphasis. And I worked with a number of different state fish and wildlife agencies in several Western states, also Hawaii, and that really led me to kind of where I am right now. So I'm a conservation social scientist, which means I study people in relation to the environment. Okay, so before we get into metrics and outcomes, look at all these SRU people in the audience. This is cool. I've got some current students out there, and I promise I did not give them extra credit for attending this talk, so I'm glad you're here. So I want to set the stage with some shared language for what I mean when I talk about environmental education, because environmental education is really kind of a broad umbrella term that focuses on creating a more sustainable future using the power of education. So in addition to being a process for learning, it's also a profession that is focused on using best practices in education to help kind of motivate some of that societal change that we need in order to address the social and environmental issues that we face. So this is a big old definition that comes from the North American Association of Environmental Ed, and I want to break it down kind of piece by piece. So environmental education is a process that helps individuals, communities, and organizations learn more about the environment. And we really think about that as a lifelong process, right? And we'll talk a bit more about that later. It develops skills, helps people develop skills to investigate their environment. So there's that skills component. And to make intelligent, informed decisions about how they can take care of it. So we always say that environmental education is not about teaching people what to think, it's about teaching people how to think. So we want to focus on that how. It has the power to transform lives and society. It informs and inspires. It motivates action. Environmental education is a key tool in creating healthier and more civically engaged communities. So when we think about, for an individual who participates in environmental education kind of across their lifespan, we want them to develop some sense of environmental literacy. So what is an environmentally literate person? Because that's one of the goals of environmental education, right? So what does that mean exactly? So an environmentally literate person is really someone who is able to take action at both the individual level and at the collective level, so in collaboration with other people, to make informed decisions concerning the environment. So this is someone who's able to act on those decisions and really has the mindset of wanting to improve the well-being of other people, societies, and also the global environment. And so this is a picture of some more Slippery Rock students that went on a trip with me last January, not this past January, but the one before, to Puerto Rico. So we partnered with Pittsburgh-based organization called Amazaje, and they organize global service learning trips for university students. And this trip was through Slippery Rock's Office for Community Engaged Learning, and we were focused on environmental justice. So the students got to learn all about mangrove conservation and how that relates to environmental justice. And this is a picture of some of them building a raised garden bed. So food justice was a huge aspect of that trip as well. So what are some of the characteristics of an environmentally literate person? So what are some of the things that we want to kind of build up in people through environmental education? So of course we have knowledge, right? So an environmentally literate person knows stuff. They know stuff about the environment. They understand environmental concepts, problems, issues. They also have a set of cognitive dispositions. And so this would be things like attitudes, values, beliefs, norms, and we'll dig into some of those in a bit. They have a set of affective dispositions, so this is more connected to the emotional realm, maybe the ability to empathize with non-human forms of life. And they have a set of cognitive skills and abilities. So think about habits of mind, right? Think about thought processes. Can they engage in critical thinking? Can they engage in problem solving? So for those of you who are educators in the room, you're probably familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. So we're looking at like the higher parts of that taxonomy. Can they evaluate? Can they analyze? And can they apply those skills to the environment? And they also possess a set of behavioral strategies that can help to apply the knowledge that they have and use the skills that they have in order to make sound and effective decisions in a whole bunch of different contexts. So I put up a pretty picture for you of a waterfall because one of the things that we know from environmental education evaluation research, especially when it comes to really heavy topics like climate change, for example, is that doom and gloom messaging is not effective in changing behavior. It just doesn't work. The evidence does not point us in that direction. But the reality is, and this is something we're all grappling with as environmental educators, all of the primary drivers of biodiversity loss are caused by people. So in the United States, we're thinking about things like climate change, things like pollution, things like disease, habitat loss and degradation, invasive species. And as those things start to happen, we are impacting the resilience of the natural world in such a way that it's not able to respond and recover. And so we're also living at a time when economic disparities, public health crises like COVID-19, and also lack of access to clean air and water are becoming even more pressing to our society. And these are issues that are disproportionately affecting communities of color, people with disabilities, and people who have otherwise been disempowered or disenfranchised by society. So we have to recognize as environmental educators that there are these systemic forces that are at play, and they might impact how somebody interacts with the natural world. And we also need to be documenting what's working and what's not when it comes to the programs that we offer so that we can do this work more effectively and make a bigger impact, because we need environmental education more now than ever before. So I am going to show you a quick video, and what I would like you to do while this is playing is, if you have maybe a piece of paper in front of you or your phone, you can grab your notes app or some way to kind of jot down some ideas. I want you to jot down what you think would tell us that environmental education was effective. So what are the markers of success? What are the indicators? How do we know that we have been effective in environmental education programming?
In the classroom, you're just sitting at your desk learning about it. Out here, you actually get to go and do it.
I just love learning how everything is interconnected and how things just rely on one another. I mean, people rely on nature more than we think. I suddenly found myself being extremely interested in other environmental things. I wasn't very much concerned about the environment until I came here, and I just saw how beautiful nature could be.
What makes a good environmental educator, I would say, someone who knows not only how to connect with nature, but also have a connection with the audience that they're serving, because you can provide and deliver this information, but also have some sort of connection with your students and build this everlasting bond.
We use a lot of citizen scientists, particularly a lot of high school students and college students. It gives these students some real hands-on experience in how to do field work and how to do conservation work, to learn the skills and the knowledge that they'll need for their entire career.
It's really a light bulb moment for the students when they can see this used cooking grease transformed into a renewable fuel. You see in their faces this pride, and then also that they realize they're connected some way with each other and their environment.
Being from the city at first, I just thought bees were pests. Bees do a lot. They pollinate the food that you eat. When you know that they're so important to everything, then you want to try to protect them like you try to protect something you love. You know?
That's awesome. That's not on the beach anymore. And never will be. So thank you all.
I became stronger, not only physically, but emotionally. I realized that I could withstand a lot of tough conditions.
It made me want to encourage myself more and be more ambitious.
I mean, I think I became more of an environmental freak to my mom. I just had a whole new outlook on life.
Awesome. Okay, so now pull out your phones or on your web browser if you've got it open, and I want you to go to menti.com. So this is going to help us create a word cloud collaboratively. So I'm going to give you a couple seconds to get there. When you get there, it's going to ask you to put in a code. So you're going to put in 5541643, and then you're going to get 3 word boxes where you can put in 3 words. So what are 3 ways, based on that short video, that you think, or 3 metrics or kind of indices that would tell us that environmental education was effective in a given context? I'll give you a couple of seconds to get there, and then I am going to go ahead and pull up the word cloud. It's thinking. You should be able to just type the, oh, there we go. Look at that. Okay, so what's going to happen as this starts to populate is you are going to see things that are mentioned more often are going to be in bigger letters. So give everybody a chance to go ahead and put their thoughts in there, and you'll notice we've got some variations on similar words. So we have things like behavior change. We have things like connections, being able to ask questions, mindset, right? So habits of mind, talked about before, action. We have knowledge, reducing climate impact, excitement, hands-on learning, so maybe hands-on experiences would connect to that. Awesome. Interconnectedness. Love it. Lots of connections. And yes, we can, oh yes, type code in the chat. I can absolutely do that. So it's going to be 5541643. And if Menti is not cooperating for you, feel free to put your 3 words in the chat so that we can still see your thoughts. Nice. So lots of different things, right? Environmental education outcomes can be quite diverse. So lots of different things here. So I'm going to go ahead and move on for the sake of time. And I want to talk for a minute about indicators of success. And this is really tying back to some of the things that all of you just mentioned. So coming from research by Byron and colleagues in 2014, there are some different types of metrics or different types of indicators that we can think about, right? We've got knowledge, which you all mentioned in the Menti activity. So knowledge of ecological systems, ecological processes, knowledge of concepts like maybe how a watershed functions or what species you could find in the stream, thinking back to my own experience participating in the program at Stackhouse Park. Where food comes from could be an example of knowledge. We can also think about something that would fall under the umbrella of practice or systems change. So this would be things like maybe a sense of agency or civic engagement, participating in the democratic process, getting involved in local efforts in your community, and feeling like you're a part of a community, a sense of community. We can look at experiences, right? So that's that hands-on learning piece. So experiencing the wonder of nature, experiencing how to grow and cook your own food, experiencing eating termites like my students did in Belize, something that you're never going to forget, right, for the rest of your life. Experiencing lab work, methods used by scientists would be another example there. And then we can think about skills. So critical thinking skills, systems thinking skills, ability to develop solutions for conservation challenges. And then several of you mentioned behavior, right? So like behavior change. I think that when, I don't want to say that. I don't want to prime you for my next question, so I take it back. All right, behavior. So you could have somebody who gets involved in citizen science. You could have somebody who participates in water conservation, someone who maybe gets involved in environmental leadership among their peers. And then attitudes. We had a couple mentions of attitudes in the previous activity too. So an attitude, like by definition, is just a positive or negative evaluation of something. So like, how do you feel in general about something like recycled water, right? Using gray water. Are you like pro or con? That's an attitude. How interested are you in scientific research could be an example of an attitude. Maybe what's your attitude toward a future career in conservation? How connected do you feel to nature? So those are all examples of attitudes. And then we can also look at ecosystem or ecosystem services types of outcomes. So someone mentioned reducing impacts related to climate change. So actually measuring like not the behavior, but the impact of that behavior on the environment. So this is really looking through a specific ecological type of lens. So improving water quality would be an example. Removing invasive species would be an example. Maybe having more locally adapted plants that are used in landscaping. And we can take Byron's work, and if we overlay that with some of my own work, these different types of metrics or indicators can be grouped together into 4 broad categories or domains. So we have a cognitive domain, which is where we would put knowledge, attitudes, skills, or I guess more accurately, self-perception of skills. We have a behavioral domain, so that's where we've got the experiences, the hands-on engagement, and the specific conservation-related behaviors that would happen as a result of the program. We have our social bucket, which would be the practice or systems change-related types of variables, and then we have the ecological domain. So this would be the impacts on the environment. So I'm going to ask you in the chat, if you had to pick one, which one of these domains do you think most people are evaluating when it comes to environmental education program evaluation? What do you think most people are measuring? And I'll share with you some of my own work in this area. So what are most people measuring? Yeah, so we've got 3 votes for cognitive so far. And yes, you are correct. So most people are measuring cognitive. So I see a couple of votes for social, cognitive and behavioral. Another cognitive. So awesome job. So based on current research on program effectiveness, so this was based on a systematic review of 79 evaluation studies published in the literature from 1990 through 2015, about 95% of those studies involved evaluation of cognitive outcomes. So behavioral was second in line, so we had about 48% measuring behavioral outcomes, and the tricky thing with behavior as an outcome is related to the way it's measured. So sometimes people are measuring the actual behaviors, but more often than not, they're measuring behavioral intentions, which is like, do you plan to participate in this behavior? Which, as I'm sure you might imagine, there are a lot of things that can get in the way of the person actually engaging in the behavior. And another way that folks will often measure behavior is like a reflection on like, did you participate in X, Y, or Z behavior, maybe how often? And there are some issues with that when it comes to memory and recall. So yeah, 48% were measuring behavior. behavior in one way, shape, or form. We had about 29% of the studies that looked at the social outcomes and about 18% who looked at the ecological outcomes. So thinking back to the video and kind of your reflection on the power of environmental education and what it can do based on the definitions and some of the things that we put up in Menti, this points to a disconnect. So none of the kids in the video were able to talk with passion about how they could identify the components of the water cycle, right? Or the parts of a food chain. That didn't come up. So what do we need to do about that in order to move forward in how we are evaluating programs? And I really want to kind of push your thinking on program evaluation for this next piece. So a couple things that need to happen, and just to give you some context for this picture, this is an aerial view of Butler County where I live, and it shows the patchwork of land use that we have, very consistent across Western Pennsylvania in many of the rural regions where we have forested areas, we have farmed areas, we've got some residential areas. I think that connects to what we're thinking about here, because there's an opportunity for us to look at a regional approach to evaluating environmental education in a way that gets at some of these outcomes that are important to us and salient here in this region. So in order to get there, we have to move past cognitive outcomes in developing or in evaluating our programs. So, and the reason for that is that we know from theory that knowledge is a really poor predictor of behavior. So just because we give somebody information about something does not mean that that is going to lead that person to change their behavior. So behavior is really complex, and it's made up of a mix of cognitions. So things like subjective norms come into play. So what do you think other people that are important to you would want you to do in a certain context? Things like attitudes come into play. Things like values come into play. And the values could influence the attitudes, which could influence the behavior. So it's this complicated mix of different cognitions. And we also need to be thinking about the person's abilities as well in the environment that they're living in, like what resources do they have around them. So there might be some barriers that get in the way of the person engaging in the behavior, even if everything else kind of lines up. And so we need to be connecting our program evaluation efforts to social science theory. And that is going to let us document the different types of outcomes that are more clearly linked theoretically to the end goal of our programs. So whether we're looking at behavior change or something along those lines. And it also means that we need to embrace a bunch of different strategies in order to evaluate those outcomes. And that's because not everything can be measured with numbers and calculations. So there's value in qualitative data when it comes to evaluating our programs. The narratives, the stories of our participants, their lived experiences participating. And that can help us move forward in the region, I think, especially when we look at some of those social outcomes. And the second point is that we need to acknowledge that human behavior is complicated, right? And how we interact with the environment represents a culmination of different experiences. So just because someone goes and participates in one program doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to result in a meaningful change, but it's the cumulative effect of those experiences over time. So think back to what I shared with you at the very beginning, right? I went to Stackhouse Park and participated in a program, but I also spent time with my mom in the outdoors exploring my neighborhood. So best case scenario is that somebody participates in a program at Phipps, and then they participate in a different program at Frick Park. And then maybe they have another interaction with a teacher or a guidance counselor or a parent. So it's the cumulative effect of those experiences that creates an environmentally literate person. And so there's an opportunity here for us to think about a regional strategy or a regional approach to how we evaluate environmental education and enhancing collaboration among all of the wonderful folks that are doing EE here in Western Pennsylvania. So, and that doesn't only include formal teachers and environmental educators, but it includes parents, it includes conservation professionals, anyone who has an opportunity to interact with humans, which is all of us, even though we're interacting through the computer right now. And so even if environmental education is not in your job title, the fact that you're here at this talk means that you need to build your own knowledge in this area so that you can contribute to what we know. So we all have a responsibility. So when I say professional development for environmental educators grounded in theory and evidence-based practice, there's an opportunity for all of us to be a part of that. Okay, so I want to quickly share a couple, I guess, kind of questions, food for thought, that I think can help guide our Q&A session. One of the things that I got involved in over the summer was watching these monarch butterflies in my yard. So I planted some milkweed, and I had some monarchs come and lay eggs, and I have been just really loving watching them. And so when the butterfly first comes out of the chrysalis, and that's what you're seeing on the right, is one that just came out, and you can see how its wings are kind of like shriveled up. So it has to hang out for a couple of hours upside down before it's ready to fly. So that's where there's this fluid inside its abdomen called hemolymph, and it's pumping that into its wings to inflate them, basically, so that it is ready to take off. And I think that this is such a great metaphor for where we were as environmental educators in March. It was like, you know, we're just happily munching along as a caterpillar, and then suddenly COVID-19, and oh my gosh, here I am. How do I navigate EE in a virtual space? What are these wings, and how do I eat, and what does that look like? And now that we are living the realities of a global pandemic and its impacts on our region, we are functioning in a different reality. So I would argue that given that new reality, the social outcomes and public health outcomes have become even more salient to us. And people are becoming increasingly aware that interacting with the environment is important for our overall health and well-being, right? So that includes mental health, physical health, spiritual health, emotional health, all the different types of health. And as we continue to grapple with social injustices in our society, we need to be able to tap into the potential of environmental education to motivate connections to the natural world, but also to encourage and motivate civic engagement that helps us support stronger, healthier, more resilient communities, more just communities. And we need to do all of this by navigating spaces where it is not always safe for us to be physically present with one another in person. So huge challenge. And I would say one of the challenges that I am seeing in my own work with students is remaining motivated and inspired. Like if you're the type of person who draws energy from other people and you're suddenly in a space where you can't do that anymore, it's really hard. But also facilitating opportunities for people to connect with nature by viewing technology as a bridge instead of a barrier. So I would encourage you to think about how technology can be a bridge and not get in the way of supporting engagement. And the good news is there are tons of resources out there. So this is not an exhaustive list by any means. We all have a lot of work to do. I'm certainly here to support that work. And there are some truly wonderful professional organizations out there that can help you to tap into a whole wide variety of expertise that can help you improve your practice in evaluating your environmental education efforts. So the North American Association for Environmental Education does an annual conference every year in October. This year's conference is virtual. The 2021 conference is in Pittsburgh, so exciting. So hopefully we are able to still make that happen, but that will be a huge opportunity for all of us here in the region. And the National Association for Interpretation is another really great resource. They have a whole bunch of webinars and different tools that are available through their website for free or at a low cost. They've got discounts for members if you're a member. And then PAEE, Pennsylvania Association of Environmental Educators, is the state affiliate of NAAEE, and we have a Facebook page for the Southwest region. Stacy is actually on this call. I saw her log in. Stacy is she maintains our email listservs for the members in the region. So if you're interested in joining PAEE or learning more about PAEE, let me know and I can connect you with her. You can join our Facebook page without even being a member, so feel free to do that and get plugged in with the environmental educators here in Southwest Pennsylvania to continue the conversation. And finally, so shameless plug for SRU, Master of Education in Environmental Ed. I would love to have some of you as students in my class. That would be pretty cool. And there are some wonderful faculty. I know we've got some of them here on this call as well at other regional colleges and universities here in the area who can help you with the theoretical connection. So to make that tangible connection to social science theory in your program evaluation efforts so that you make sure you're not getting stuck in that rut of evaluating knowledge and you're starting to think about some of those other constructs that can give you a more meaningful and robust interpretation of the effectiveness of your programs. So I am actually going to, before I forget, I'm going to give you my email address in the chat. So if you have questions or you want to follow up with me directly, feel free to do that via email. And yeah, I guess we're Q&A time now, yeah?